Hi friends, hope you are doing well. So today I am going to make an important video, and the topic is going to be about whether you should do an MTech degree, that is the Master in Technology, from the Indian institutions, or you should aspire for a MS degree in US. Now you probably know that a very large number of Indian students come to the US. In fact, this is now the largest source of foreign students into the United States, and recently they have also crossed China in this matter. So I have seen in many classes, such as if you go to a typical class in machine learning in any US university, you will find that up to 80 or more % of the students are actually Indian students. These are foreign students. And so what has happened is that many of these guys, they shell out tens of thousands of dollars to do these degrees, and then they aspire for a job in the US in most cases. Now, of course, the alternative situation is also there, that you could do a degree in India itself. Remember, there are plethora of top institutes there. For example, the Indian Institute of Science, the Indian Institute of Technologies, the National Institute of Technologies, the IIIT, then there is IISc, there are the NITs and so on, and also you have many more institutes such as the IISER, etc. So in fact, if you were to give the GATE exam, you can qualify for a scholarship in most of these Indian institutions. So you can do a master's degree, typically an MTech degree, with scholarship as far as these institutes are concerned. So GATE qualified candidates get a stipend, which essentially means that they get a free master's degree. They also get accommodation in the hostels, in the dorms, and also they get food in the mess halls out there. So actually it's a very conducive process to doing a degree. Now I'm going to discuss 7 points today about the advantages and disadvantages of each decision, and then you can of course consider which is better for you. Now do remember that jobs are there in both the countries. So almost all the top companies in the US are also there in the Indian ecosystem, and in fact you also have a lot of European companies, Asian companies, and so on in the Indian ecosystem. So I would say that company choice is not an issue here. Now let's start with the number one issue, and that has to do with money. So of course, if you do not get a scholarship in US university, you have to pay a lot of money for tuition, and this will entail tens of thousands of dollars. So I know of students who have spent maybe $100,000, maybe twice that amount, thrice that amount, to do a master's degree in the US. Now, of course, this is only possible for a few people, but what is happening more and more is that students are persuading their parents to take education loan and send them to the US. So do keep this in mind, that in many cases the education loan is actually funding this degree. Now, when I was doing my master's degree in the US, it was actually quite uncommon for people to pay their way for a master's degree. In fact, all the students at that time would get scholarships, at least the Indian students. It were only the Korean students and some Taiwanese students and students from Hong Kong who were paying their way for the master's degree. So Indian and Chinese students at that point simply didn't have enough money to pay for the degrees. This was somewhere in the late 1980s. Now, of course, the things have changed dramatically today. What happened is that people started paying their way for the master's degree. So the master's degree scholarships have progressively dried up in the US universities. The US universities now find that they can make good money out of getting the foreign students for the master's degree program, because these guys are not only paying tuition, they are often paying out of state tuition, which is quite considerable if you consider any state university. So of course now it's hard to get a master's degree scholarship in most cases. Some guys still get it if they have really good GRE scores, if they are from top universities and top institutes, but it is becoming more difficult. In fact, PhD students are the ones who now have an easier time getting scholarships. So this is of course the main issue. In many cases you may simply not have enough money to come to the US, and the natural choice is then to do a Master of Technology degree from the Indian institutions. And what I will tell you, that as far as bachelor's and master's degrees are concerned, the Indian institutions are at par with any US institution. The difference starts happening at the PhD level, because PhD is about research, so you need people to guide you, and the guide may be different. So what has happened is that in some of the developed countries there are a plethora of PhD advisors out there, highly qualified people who can guide you. But in developing countries, there tend to be less people who have the PhD expertise, who have expertise in terms of guiding you for new problems and so on. So the research infrastructure may not be to the level in the US, but I would say as the master's degree is mostly course based with a small component for project and thesis, it is certainly possible to get a good master's degree from the Indian institutions and get a good job after that. So that brings me to next point, which is about jobs. And like I mentioned before, you can always get jobs whether you are in India or the US. The advantage of being in India, if you are an Indian citizen, is that you do not need a visa. You can simply get your degree, and at the end of it, you can get a job in one of the top companies, maybe Google, maybe Microsoft, maybe in the different banks such as Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and so on. And also you can get it in various hardware companies such as Intel, Viasat, and so on. So there are a plethora of companies out there in India. Almost all the top technology companies which are listed in the US Stock Exchange, such as the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, are present in the Indian system. So you can get job anywhere. But the problem is the salary. So as far as the US is concerned, your starting salaries could be somewhere from $80,000 to $120,000 or even more. And as far as the Indian system is concerned, your starting salary may be $10,000 to $20,000 if you are doing an MTech degree and looking for a job. Now, of course, one of the issues has to do with purchasing power parity. You all know that the rupee is different from the dollar. And as far as the Indian system is concerned, the rupee goes a long way compared to the rupee as it goes in the US. So that's again something to keep in mind. You need to make these particular calculations as to what is the purchasing power parity in terms of whatever you are earning in the Indian system. Now let us come to point number 3, which has to do with visa. Now what's been happening with the F1 visa, which is the visa you need to come to the US as a student, is that there is a lot of rejection here. So almost 20 to 30% of the F1 cases get rejected. And this has been happening due to many reasons. Remember, there are 2 criteria for giving the F1 visa. There is the 214B criteria, which means that the officer has to figure out that you are not somebody who is going to migrate to the US. And this is of course something which is rather difficult to prove. So many cases the people are not able to get this particular visa. Also, there are issues related to the financial situation of the people having too many relatives in the US, and so on. The second issue of course has to do with the 221G. So again, the 221G is a scenario where the officers actually need more time to come to a decision. So in many cases, this system goes through a long time and they send it to various departments of the US government, and it may take you 6 months or 8 months to get the visa, in which case what may happen is that you may simply miss the deadline as far as the admission is concerned. So these are some of the problems here. I'm going to put videos on the end screen which is going to tell you more things about these particular problems. Now, of course, if you are in the Indian system, you don't need any visa to get a job, so that's an advantage. Now, in US, even if you are able to come and study with the F1 visa, you have to do the F1 practical training. That is something which is possible. It lets you work in the US for 3 years, and this is only for STEM graduate, that is science, technology, engineering, and math. So if you are a non-STEM graduate, there are problems. You can only work for 1 year. And what happens is that in many cases, especially when there is a recession or a downturn, the employers are not very willing to sponsor people for the H-1B visa. There is a H-1 cap and so on. So it often becomes difficult to get a job. So in many cases, if they are able to get green card holders or US citizens, they may not go for the F1 practical training and the H-1B people. So in these cases, what can happen in the worst case scenario is that you can take a very large education loan and you may have to go back to your home country, and the salaries which you get there may not be sufficient to pay off this loan. So you may have to work for 10 or 20 years to pay off this loan. So again, this is a problem which can happen to you. Now, the number 5th issue is a good point about coming to the US, and this has to do with the US experience. Now, whenever you come to a developed country such as the US, you have a lot of advantages. Now, you gain a lot in terms of the critical thinking. So the way things are taught in the US is very different from India, where you are mostly focused on rote learning. So in US, you have to do a lot of projects, you have to do a lot of term papers, you have to write your own thesis and so on. And so you have a lot of work which you need to do. In Many cases you may also have to work in teams for projects, so a lot of skills which are very much required by the corporate sectors are developed during the process, such as the capability of working in teams, such as making PowerPoint presentations, such as writing good reports and so on, such as interacting well with the manager, such as talking and so on. So in fact, communication skills and soft skills are the more important skills in many cases, especially if you're looking for jobs in good companies. And these skills are something which is much easier to develop if you are doing a US degree. Now let's come to the next issue, which has to do with migration. And of course, this is the reason, one of the main reasons that the students in fact try to come to US, that this is not something they are going to tell the officer, but that may be the main reason. So again, the reasons driving migration include high pay, the fact that you are going to be able to be in a country which has relatively low population density, low pollution, the roads may be better, the traffic may be better, the water may be better, and so on. And so many of these things act as a pull factor, bringing in people to the US from around the world. This is especially so when you are from the middle classes. So in those cases, life in India can be quite difficult. Now, of course, one of the negative points here is that if you have too many relatives in US, you may be subject to the 214B problem, which is that the officer may say that you are planning to migrate to the US using the F1 visa, and this is not something which they often like to do. So this is again something you have to keep in mind if you are somebody who feels a strong desire to migrate to the US. This is of course possible, but you can also migrate later using the L1 visa, for example, using the H1B and so on. So there are a plethora of workers in the US, particularly in software engineering in various fields, who have never done a degree from the US. So do remember that even if you come to the US, do the MS degree and get a job, you will have to compete with all these people who have done their degrees in India and they have landed up here on the H1B visa or the L1 visa or any of the other visas. Sometimes they may even get the O1 visa, or after some time they get a green card. So this is something which often happens in the skill-based fields, is that what matters is that you know a certain thing, you know Python, you know C++, you know machine learning, and that is the more important thing here. Finally, the seventh point has to do with complexity. So this is of course a broader topic, that whenever you are trying to move to a foreign country, over time your life is going to become more complex. You are going to have to go back and forth between your home country and the foreign country. There are issues which are going to be there related to culture. Maybe you were part of the majority community in your home country, now you are part of a minority community. The patterns in terms of food are different, the patterns in terms of religion are different, and various political issues tend to be different. So what I have seen with many of the non-resident Indians who are there in the US is that they cling back to their old culture. They cling to the culture which was many years ago, maybe 10-20 years ago. And as far as people who are back there, what happens is that they keep changing with the culture. So many a time when people go back to India after 20 years or 30 years of staying in the US, they think how much India has changed, but in many cases they have not changed much. They have remained quite conservative in their thinking. They have not modernized because they think that the modernization is part of the US culture. They are not part of it. They have stuck to their old ways in the Indian culture and system. So this is something which will not happen if you remain in your home country. You keep changing with the times, and what happens is that after a long period of time, there is slowly a convergence of cultures between the various countries, because this is part of the process of modernization. This is how societies function. People are more and more independent. They make their own choices, they make their own decisions, and therefore they are going to do whatever they want to do. And the old days which were good for you may not be the good old days for the present generation of people. So this was my take about the issue about whether you should do an MTech degree or you should do the MS degree in US. I again gave you various suggestions. I didn't give a final conclusion. And so that's generally the case. In the end, all the decisions have to be made by you yourself. I'm going to provide some links on the end screen which are going to guide you further into this particular problem.